My friends, let us come together for a moment of stillness, for it is only in the quietness of the heart that the true message of spirit can be heard. We live in an age in which many sincere seekers have turned to the spiritual path with noble intentions, seeking release from fear, from limitation, from struggle. And yet, in this sincere seeking, a subtle misunderstanding has arisen, a misunderstanding that sits at the very heart of modern spirituality and obscures the simple, living truth that Jesus taught today. Everywhere you look, you will find teachings on how to shape your life through the power of the mind, how to manifest abundance, how to attract health, how to create success. People are told to visualize, to affirm, to command the universe to deliver their desires. And though there may be temporary results, though there may be moments when the outer world seems to bend to human intention, yet these are not spiritual demonstrations. These belong to the realm of mind, not the realm of spirit. They require effort, they demand continual maintenance, and the one who manifests in this way remains anxious, for whatever is created by the mind must be sustained by the mind. Jesus never taught that. The Master revealed something infinitely more profound. He did not come to show us how to manipulate outer conditions. He came to reveal the presence that already is, the kingdom that is already established, the harmony that requires no human will to bring it forth. And so when we see Jesus multiply loaves, or still a storm, or raise the sick to wholeness, we are not witnessing a man using power. We are witnessing a man who rests in the awareness of the one power, and from that awareness, harmony flows without resistance. Joel Goldsmith discovered and lived this same truth. He realized that all attempts to manifest arise from a hidden belief that something is missing, that something must be added, that life as it is given is insufficient. This belief is the root of all struggle. For as long as you feel the need to attract what you think you lack, you remain bound to the very sense of separation that gives rise to lack in the first place. Manifestation begins with the assumption of absence. Spiritual realization begins with the recognition of fullness. Do you see the difference? One says, I must make something happen. The other says, God's work is already complete. The modern world has taught people to reach outward, to reach toward a God who must be persuaded, a universe that must be instructed, a destiny that must be shaped through mental force. But the spiritual life begins not in reaching outward, but in turning inward, in sinking gently into the awareness that all that God is already expressing itself as your life. This is the shift Jesus came to introduce. This is the shift Goldsmith devoted his life to revealing. The power is not in your thought. The power is in God realized. The miracle is not in the mental act. The miracle is in the awareness of the infinite invisible that is present here and now. And so I say to you, if you have struggled to manifest, if you have felt exhausted by effort, if you have feared that your spiritual life was not strong enough to change your circumstances, then take heart, for the truth is not found in effort. It is found in surrender, not in controlling conditions, but in recognizing that the Spirit of God already stands where the problem appears. Let us set aside for the next hour every belief in personal will, personal power, personal effort. Let us enter this teaching as Jesus intended it, as a revelation that God is the substance, the law, the life, the activity, and the harmony of your being. When this truth dawns, You discover that nothing must be created, nothing must be drawn to you, nothing must be changed. You discover that the kingdom was always here, awaiting your recognition. Let us begin the journey. Let us continue now, my friends, deeper into the heart of this teaching. For if we are to understand why the works of Jesus flowed without strain, without hesitation, without effort, we must understand the profound distinction between mental force and spiritual realization. These two appear similar on the surface, for both may be followed by visible results, yet they arise from entirely different states of consciousness and lead to entirely different outcomes. The mind, you see, is the instrument of the personal sense of self. It is the tool of the I that believes it is separate from God, separate from supply, separate from harmony. And so the mind attempts to bridge this imagined separation through effort, through intention, through affirmation, through visualization. It seeks to draw into the self what the self believes it does not yet possess. But no matter how refined the technique, the fundamental premise remains the same. I am here, and what I need is out there. I must reach for it. I must bring it to myself. This, my friends, is mental force. This is the realm of the personal will. This is the domain of the human mind. But spiritual realization is entirely different. Spiritual realization is not the act of drawing something into your experience. It is the recognition that everything that God is, you already are. Everything that God has, you already express. Everything that God knows is already present within the consciousness that is your true identity. In spiritual realization, you do not attempt to make something happen. You quietly perceive that God is the source, the substance, and the activity of all being, and therefore nothing can be added to the infinite, and nothing can be taken from it. You see, the mind works through effort. Spirit works through effortless unfolding. The mind tries to achieve. Spirit simply is. Mental force says, I will make this occur. Spiritual realization says, the Father within doeth the works. The mind stands outside the kingdom and attempts to break in. Spirit recognizes that the kingdom is already within. Now, why does this matter? Because all spiritual demonstration, healing, supply, harmony, peace flows from realization, not from effort. When the mind attempts to manipulate outer conditions, it can produce only temporary results, for it is dealing in the realm of effects. But spiritual realization touches cause. And when cause is realized, effects harmonize naturally. Imagine, if you will, a lamp. The mind attempts to rearrange the shadows on the wall, pushing them here and there, trying desperately to improve the picture. Spirit, however, switches on the light, and in the presence of light, shadows simply cease to be. Not by effort, not by command, by the nature of light itself, so it is with the presence. This is why Joel Goldsmith emphasized again and again that the human mind is not the instrument of spiritual attainment. It cannot reach God. It cannot contact infinity. It cannot create harmony. Only through inner stillness, through relinquishment of personal will, through the deep recognition that God alone is, do we enter the atmosphere of realization where miracles become natural, To depend on the mind is to struggle. To depend on spirit is to rest. To depend on technique is to fear. To depend on God realized is to live in peace. And here is a truth that may startle you. Every time you attempt to manifest something, you are declaring that God has not yet done his work. You are affirming that something is missing in the universe. You are strengthening the very belief in lack that you are trying to escape. But the moment you turn inward and become still, the moment you release the personal sense of I must achieve, you enter the state of consciousness in which the infinite moves freely. And in that consciousness, harmony appears not because you made it appear, but because it was always there, waiting for your recognition. This is the difference between mental force and spiritual realization. One exhausts you, the other liberates you. One pushes, the other allows. One strives, the other rests in the certainty of God's completeness. As we proceed, keep this distinction clear in your heart, for without it, no spiritual teaching makes sense. With it, the entire message of the Master becomes radiant, simple, and alive. Let us continue now and turn our attention to one of the most profound statements ever spoken in the history of spiritual life. It is a sentence so simple that many overlook it, yet within it lies the entire secret of the Master's healing ministry, the entire explanation of his miracle work, and the very heart of what Joel Goldsmith devoted his life to teaching. Jesus said, "I can of mine own self do nothing." My friends, pause for a moment and let those words rest within you, not as a doctrine, not as a theological idea, but as the living truth spoken by one who walked in full awareness of the infinite. I can of mine own self do nothing. Here was a man who healed the sick, lifted the dead, multiplied supply, and stilled the storm. Yet he did not claim the power to do these things. He claimed no personal ability, no spiritual technique, no mental mastery. Instead, he proclaimed absolute dependence on the presence, that he called the Father the invisible, the infinite, the one. What he was saying is this: the human self, the personal I, has no capacity to heal, to supply, or to save. The personal self does not perform miracles. The presence performs them. And only when the personal self is silent enough to allow it. This is the key. The secret of Jesus' life was not power. It was emptiness. It was the absence of the personal sense of self. When Jesus stood before the multitudes, he did not think, how shall I feed them? What shall I do? He simply turned within to the awareness of the Father's fullness, and that fullness expressed itself outwardly as supply. When the sick were brought to him, he did not struggle to remove disease. He did not battle with appearances. He rested in the recognition that God is the only life. And in the presence of that recognition, disease lost all reality. He did not do these things. He witnessed them. He saw through the appearance to the presence. He saw beyond the condition to the perfection. He saw past the form to the reality. And in that seeing, in that divine vision, the outer world yielded to truth. Now listen carefully, for this is where the distinction becomes clear. Jesus never believed that he possessed a power. He never believed that God had given him a special ability. He never believed that the miracles were signs of personal greatness. He said, "The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works." This is spiritual realization. This is the state of consciousness in which miracles become natural. Joel Goldsmith lived in this same awareness. He knew that the moment he tried to heal someone, the healing was obstructed. He knew that the moment he attempted to use God as a means to produce results, the presence receded from conscious experience. For God cannot be used. God can only be realized. And so he followed the Master in this profound truth. I can of mine own self do nothing. This statement is not a confession of weakness. It is the doorway to infinite strength. It is not an admission of lack. It is the recognition of the only source. It is not the posture of the helpless. It is the posture of the illumined. For in the very moment you acknowledge, I can do nothing, you make room for the presence to do everything. You withdraw the false belief in personal power, and you stand as an empty vessel through which the infinite can pour itself forth. This is why Jesus moved with such calmness. This is why he never hurried, never feared, never strained. This is why his works were instantaneous and effortless. He was not drawing upon human resources. He was not using mental energy. He was not commanding spiritual laws. He was abiding in the great truth that the Father within is the only doer. And my friends, this truth is not reserved for him alone. It is the truth of your being. It is the truth of every soul. It is the truth that stands ready to transform your life the moment you cease trying to accomplish life through personal power. As long as you believe, I must make this happen, you live outside the grace of spiritual realization. But the instant you whisper within, Father, I of myself can do nothing, a great peace descends, and the presence begins its quiet work lifting, healing, supplying, guiding, restoring. Let this truth sink deeply into your heart, for it is the turning point of the entire path. Until you understand this, the spiritual life remains a struggle, but once you see it, you realize that you were never meant to carry the burden of life. Life is lived through you by the infinite, and so we continue in this awareness, letting the Master's words become our own, not as imitation, but as realization. I can of mine own self do nothing. The Father within doeth the works. This is the beginning of true spiritual freedom. Let us move now into the heart of the matter, the essence from which all spiritual demonstration proceeds. For unless we understand the nature of true power, we will continue to seek God as though God was separate from us, as though God must be persuaded, or summoned, or directed. And in this misunderstanding, we remain bound to the realm of personal effort. Joel Goldsmith expressed this truth in a single, luminous statement. God realized is the only power. Not God spoken of, not God believed in, not God worshipped from afar, but God realized, God experienced as a living presence, felt within one's own being. This realization is the foundation of all spiritual power. Without it, we are but human beings struggling with human problems. With it, we become transparencies through which the infinite expresses itself effortlessly. Now, what does it mean to realize God? It does not mean to declare that God exists. It does not mean to affirm spiritual truths over and over again. It does not mean to memorize scripture or recite principles. To realize God is to enter the silent awareness that the presence is here, that it is the life of you, the mind of you, the very being that animates your existence. It is the recognition that you are not a separate creature living in a world of danger and uncertainty, but a spiritual expression of the one life that knows no limitation. True power, my friends, is not something you possess. It is something that possesses you. It is something that fills you, moves you, lives through you. When the personal sense of self grows quiet enough to allow it, mental power attempts to direct the universe. Spiritual power recognizes that the universe is already governed by the One. Mental power tries to overcome obstacles. Spiritual power sees that there are no obstacles in God. Mental power seeks healing. Spiritual power beholds the wholeness already present. This is why Jesus never struggled with conditions. He never attempted to overcome disease or lack or fear. He simply realized God. He lived in the awareness of the Father's presence, and in that awareness, nothing unlike God could appear as power. You see, in the presence of the infinite, the finite dissolves. In the presence of wholeness, sickness cannot stand. In the presence of abundance, lack becomes impossible. In the presence of truth, error is revealed as nothingness. It is not that God destroys these conditions, rather, they are seen for what they are, shadows without substance, illusions born from the belief in separation. And when the light of realization dawns, shadows disappear of their own accord. And so Goldsmith taught, do not try to remove the problem, realize God, and the problem dissolves. This is the great paradox of spiritual power. You do not use it, you yield to it, you do not direct it, you become still enough that it may direct you. You do not attempt to bring God into your situation. You awaken to the truth that God is the very presence of the situation itself. When you attempt to manifest, you remain in the realm of personal will, but when you realize God, the activity of the infinite becomes the only activity of your life. You move through the world with a quiet certainty, not the certainty that you can make things happen, but the certainty that the Father's harmony is already established, and you need only bear witness to it. This realization brings with it a deep, unshakable peace. You discover that nothing can separate you from supply, for supply is God expressed. Nothing can separate you from health, for health is God revealed. Nothing can threaten your harmony, for harmony is the nature of the presence that is your very life. And in this awareness, you no longer fear conditions, for you see that conditions have no power. Only the realized presence has power. And as your consciousness rests in this truth, the outer world aligns itself not because you commanded it, but because you recognize the only cause in the universe. Spiritual power is not dramatic. It is not forceful. It is not loud. It is a quiet presence, felt in the stillness of the soul, revealing itself as peace, as assurance, as the effortless unfolding of all good. And so we take this truth into the deepest part of our being. God realized is the only power. There is no power in the problem. There is no power in appearance. There is only the presence, infinite, complete, and already functioning. When this becomes your foundation, the spiritual life ceases to be a struggle and becomes a resting in the grace of the One who lives you. Let us now turn inward to a very tender point in the spiritual life, a point that touches the experience of nearly every sincere seeker. Many have prayed with intensity, affirmed with dedication, visualized with discipline, and yet found themselves circling the same mountain of need, financial strain, emotional unrest, sickness, or lack of direction. And in their quiet hours, they wonder, why does it not work for me? My friends, it does not work because you are beginning at the wrong place. You are beginning from lack. Every attempt to manifest, every attempt to attract, every attempt to change the outer scene arises from a hidden assumption. Something is missing. Something must be added. Something that I need is not yet here. And the moment you accept this assumption, you have stepped out of the kingdom and into the land of shadows. For the kingdom of God contains no lack, and the consciousness that seeks to remedy lack is already living outside the spiritual reality of completeness. This is the invisible root of every failed manifestation, the belief that you are separate from the infinite source. When you begin with lack, you cannot end with fulfillment. When you begin with fear, you cannot end with peace. When you begin with the belief that something must be added, you cannot awaken to the truth that everything has already been given. Consider this carefully, for it is subtle. It is not your technique that fails you. It is not affirmations that fail. It is not meditation that fails. It is the consciousness of need behind all these practices that keeps the door closed. Need can only attract more need. Fear can only produce more fear. Effort can only give rise to more effort. And so long as you feel that you must reach outward for supply, you are unknowingly declaring that supply is outside of you, separate from you, distant from your being. But the moment you believe supply is out there, you have denied the truth that God is your supply, functioning as your very life, expressing as your consciousness. Joel Goldsmith taught that what we call lack is never a condition. It is a belief, a shadow on the surface of consciousness. And the more we wrestle with the shadow, the more real it appears. The human mind tries to meet need by adding money, adding health, adding love, adding opportunity, but spirit does not add. Spirit reveals. Spirit reveals the fullness that already exists behind the appearance of lack. Spirit unveils the substance that has never been absent. Spirit lifts the veil from the eyes of the seeker until he sees that what he thought he lacked has been present all along. You cannot manifest what already is. You can only awaken to it. And this awakening cannot occur while the mind is busy trying to fix, change, attract, or compel. The mind that strives is the mind that believes something is missing. And the presence cannot reveal itself in a consciousness occupied with the conviction of separation. Do you understand now why manifestation exhausts you? Why it produces anxiety instead of peace? Why it yields temporary changes that so quickly collapse? It is because manifestation, as taught by the world, begins with the assumption that reality is incomplete. But spiritual realization begins with the truth that reality is whole, and you need only recognize this wholeness to experience it. When the inner sense of lack is dissolved, the outer expression of lack disappears, not because you attracted something new, but because you ceased believing in the absence of God. Let this truth sink gently into your heart. There is no lack in God. There is no absence in infinity. There is no gap in the wholeness of spirit. Whatever appears as lack in your life is not a condition to be corrected. It is a perception to be healed. The moment you realize that supply is not something you must get, but something you already are, God expressing as your consciousness, then the appearance of lack dissolves naturally, without struggle, without strain. You will discover that the supply you have sought flows to you not as something newly created, but as something newly recognized. You will discover that health arises not as something manufactured, but as something unveiled. You will discover that harmony appears, not because you willed it, but because the presence that is harmony finally found your consciousness empty enough to reveal itself. And so, my friends, we come to the great turning point of this teaching. Stop trying to manifest. Start realizing truth. For manifestation fails because it begins with lack. Realization succeeds because it begins with God. Now, my friends, let us turn our attention to the manner in which the Master moved through this world. For in understanding the way Jesus worked, we understand the very nature of spiritual demonstration. If you study the gospel record carefully, you will see something remarkable. Jesus never rushed. He never strained. He never worried. He never pleaded with God. Instead, he lived in a continual state of inner poise, a quiet recognition of the invisible fullness of the Father. He did not work miracles. He rested in the truth, and the truth revealed itself as the miracle. Let us look closely, for there is a pattern in his ministry, a spiritual rhythm that was present in every healing, in every supply, in every act of grace. 1. He turned away from the appearance. When Jesus was faced with a storm, he did not fight the wind. When he was informed of disease, he did not battle with illness. When he was told there was no bread, he did not consider lack. He refused to grant power to the visible form. He denied the reality of that which God did not create. He knew that the outer scene was but a shadow of consciousness, and therefore not the truth of God's creation. This was his first act, non-recognition of error. He simply would not accept appearance as power. 2. He entered the silence. Before any outward change occurred, there was an inward movement. Jesus withdrew not necessarily from the crowd, but from the belief in two powers. He turned within. He entered the secret place of the Most High. He rested in stillness until the awareness of the Father's presence filled his consciousness. This was not a technique, it was communion. It was the quiet immersion in the truth that God is the only cause, the only power, the only life. 3. He acknowledged the fullness of the Father. He did not plead for supply. He did not beg for healing. He did not ask the Father to intervene from afar. He simply recognized the spiritual fact. Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me, and that thou hearest me always. This was his realization. The fullness is here. The kingdom is here. The harmony is here. The life of God is already functioning where the appearance of discord seems to be. He did not try to make something happen. He acknowledged what already is. 4. He allowed the invisible to reveal itself. After turning away from the appearance, after entering the silence, after recognizing the fullness of God, Jesus simply stood still inwardly, and the outer world adjusted itself to the truth he was beholding. The storm quieted, the loaves multiplied, the sick rose, the blind saw, not by his effort, but by his recognition, not through command, but through realized presence, not through human will, but through divine unfoldment. Joel Goldsmith understood this perfectly. He knew that Jesus was not performing miracles, he was witnessing the activity of the Father, and Joel's own healing ministry flowed from the same consciousness. He understood that you cannot heal by opposing the condition, and you cannot supply by fighting lack. You must stand still in the realization of God as the only life, the only substance, and the only power. Let us understand this deeply. Jesus did not work miracles to change conditions. He worked from the awareness that conditions have no power to contradict God. When the infinite becomes the only presence in consciousness, the appearance harmonizes of its own accord. This is the way of the Christ. This is the way of spiritual power. This is the way by which all true healing occurs. Now consider how different this is from the modern attempt to manifest. Manifestation begins with tension. I must create, I must attract, I must shift the energy. Jesus began with rest. The Father within doeth the works. Manifestation begins with desire, I need this outcome. Jesus began with realization. All that the Father hath is mine. Manifestation attempts to change the outer world. Jesus saw no need to change what God had already included in the fullness of being. To walk in the Master's way is to release the belief that you must make life happen. It is to sink gently into the awareness that the Father's perfection is already expressed as your life, and that no effort on your part can add a single cubit to the stature of God's creation. This is the spiritual method. This is the way miracles occur. This is what Joel Goldsmith called impersonalizing the problem and realizing the presence. And so, as we proceed deeper into this teaching, let us hold this truth before us always. What you are seeking is already present, and the way of the Master is not to bring it forth by force, but to behold it with a consciousness free of fear. Now, my friends, having understood the principle, let us gently turn to its application, not as a technique, not as a method to accomplish something, but as a way of entering the atmosphere of spiritual realization, for truth must be lived. It must be practiced in the quiet, secret places of consciousness until it becomes the natural state of our being. Let us remember this always. The purpose of practice is not to make something happen. The purpose of practice is to remove the veil of the personal sense of self so that the presence may reveal itself. Manifesting begins with doing. Recognizing begins with being. And so, I will offer you not exercises, but inner movements, gentle shifts of awareness that lift you into the realization of the already finished kingdom. 1. The sacred pause before action. Whenever a problem appears, whether it be a bill, a diagnosis, a fear, or a conflict, do not rush to correct it. Do not rush to pray for its removal. Do not rush to seek solutions or strategies. Let your first response be silence. Pause. Let the mind become still for a moment. Feel the spaciousness that opens when you refuse to engage the problem as though it had power. In that pause, you step out of the world of appearances and into the awareness of the invisible. In that pause, you declare without words, there is only God here. This pause may last only a breath, yet within it, the entire shift from human effort to divine recognition begins. 2. Entering the silence of non-request. After the pause, you turn inward, not to ask, not to plead, not to affirm, but to listen. This listening is the essence of spiritual practice. Do not bring your problem to God. Bring your stillness to God, for the presence is not reached through words. It is touched in silence, and in this silence, you rest gently in the awareness that God already knows, already is, already expresses the fullness of harmony right where the appearance seems to be. Let the mind grow quiet enough that the whisper of spirit may be felt not as a voice, not as a message, but as a subtle sense of peace, a lifting, a softening, a release of fear. This is communion. This is meditation. This is the way of Christ. 3. The gentle recognition of truth. Now, within this quietness, allow a simple recognition to arise, not as affirmation, but as realization. Father, thy work is already complete. The presence is here. All that God is expressing itself in this very place. Do not try to feel anything. Do not try to make anything happen. Do not strain for spiritual experience. Let recognition come as softly as a feather settling on still water. Let it be enough simply to acknowledge, in spirit, this is already finished. For it is not emotion that heals. It is not intensity that heals. It is the quiet recognition of truth that dissolves the illusion of separation. 4. The unhurried allowing of divine activity. Once you have recognized the presence, do nothing. Remain still for a few moments. Let the activity of God be the only activity. Let the infinite invisible fulfill its own nature as harmony without your interference, without your direction. When the mind is silent, grace flows. When the personal self withdraws, the Father within acts, and you will discover something beautiful. Outer action will present itself naturally. What needs to be done will arise of its own accord. The phone call, the conversation, the step forward, all of these will come not from fear, not from effort, not from problem solving, but from the quiet intelligence of spirit moving through you. Do not rush, do not force, do not decide from the mind. Let action emerge from peace, not from panic. Let movement arise from inner stillness, not from the urgency of the world. This is what Goldsmith called the activity of the Christ within. 5. Returning to recognition throughout the day. Your spiritual practice does not end with a single moment of meditation. It continues in small ways as you move throughout your day. When you feel tension, pause again. When fear returns, become still again. When doubt whispers, recognize again. Not as a struggle, not as a battle, but as a gentle turning of the attention from appearance to reality. Every time you make this inward turn, you loosen the bonds of the old consciousness and strengthen the habit of living in the presence. Over time, you will notice that the moments of remembering become more frequent, and the moments of forgetting become shorter. This is how realization deepens quietly, naturally, without pressure. 6. Living without a goal. And now, my friends, let me share a truth that may surprise you. The moment you practice with the intention of achieving a result, you step out of spirit and back into the world of manifestation. Practice is not a means to an end. Practice is the end. Practice is the recognition of God, not the pursuit of outcomes. You do not meditate to gain supply. You meditate to realize the presence. And in the realization of presence, supply flows naturally. You do not practice stillness to attract harmony. You practice stillness because harmony is already the nature of the presence in which you live and move and have your being. Let your spiritual practice be free of purpose. Let it be an opening, not a strategy. Let it be an act of love, not an act of need. For where purpose ends, God begins. 7. The gradual transformation of consciousness. As you continue in these inner movements, something begins to shift, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like dawn rising without announcement. You begin to feel less urgency. You begin to experience more peace. You begin to notice that problems do not cling to you as they once did. And gradually, the outer world begins to unfold in harmony, not because you shaped it, but because the consciousness you carry is no longer vibrating with fear, with want, with separation. This is the fruit of recognition. This is the evidence of God realized. And so these simple practices, pausing, listening, recognizing, allowing, become the basis of a life lived not in manifesting, but in witnessing the eternal activity of the Father. Now, my friends, we come to a place of gentle wonder, the point at which the inner transformation begins to reveal itself outwardly, for you do not realize God for the purpose of improving your circumstances, and yet your circumstances inevitably change. You do not rest in the presence to obtain harmony, and yet harmony unfolds of itself. You do not turn within to attract supply, and yet supply appears without strain. Why is this? Because the outer world is nothing more than a mirror of consciousness. When consciousness is lifted, the world that appears to you is lifted. When fear dissolves, the forms fear produce dissolve. When separation is healed, the effects of separation fade away. Outward change is not the goal of spiritual realization. It is the fruit, the natural, effortless fruit of a consciousness that has ceased to resist the activity of the infinite. Let us look gently at how this unfolds. 1. Problems quietly dissolve. You will discover that many of the difficulties that once troubled you no longer arise. People who once caused tension no longer disturb you. Situations that once frightened you no longer threaten your peace. Areas of your life that seemed endlessly problematic begin to smooth themselves without intervention. It is not that the world changed. It is that you changed. The consciousness that attracted disturbance is no longer present, and so disturbance has no foothold. The world cannot bring to you what is not in your consciousness. And as the old patterns dissolve, you will marvel at the simplicity of it. You mean it was always this easy? Yes, my friends, because the difficulty was never in the condition. It was in the belief that you were separate from the infinite too. Supply flows without pursuit. As realization deepens, you begin to notice that what you need appears at the moment you need it. Opportunities arise without effort. Resources come from unexpected directions. People who can help you cross your path naturally. You may wonder, why is this happening now, when nothing seems to have changed? But something has changed. The sense of lack has dissolved. You no longer approach life as a seeker with empty hands. You walk in the awareness that all that the Father hath is mine, and the outer world reflects that inner abundance. This is not manifesting. This is recognizing. And recognition is the doorway through which supply reveals itself. 3. Healing occurs without seeking. Many people expect healing to be something dramatic, a flash of divine energy, an instantaneous miracle. But spiritual healing, as Jesus and Goldsmith understood it, is often quiet, gradual, imperceptible. You simply notice one day that the pain is lighter, the symptoms keener, the fear surrounding the condition has dissolved, and eventually the condition itself is gone. Why? Because when consciousness realizes that God is the only life, the false sense of a separate, vulnerable life loses its seeming power. The body reflects the peace of the soul. Healing is not an event. It is an unfoldment of realized oneness. 4. Relationships harmonize naturally as inner fear dissolves, as judgment softens, as the sense of being a separate self diminishes. Something beautiful happens in your relationships. You no longer approach others from need. You no longer seek validation. You no longer defend yourself or react from the old wounds. You begin to see others through the lens of spiritual identity, not as personalities with flaws and limitations, but as expressions of the same one life that expresses as you. And in that recognition, harmony is restored. Some relationships gently fall away, others deepen, tensions soften, old patterns fade. You did not fix the relationship, you recognized the truth, and the relationship aligned with that recognition. 5. Creativity and purpose express themselves effortlessly when fear is no longer governing your life. Creativity flows. When self-concern diminishes, purpose clarifies. When you are no longer driven by survival, the deeper movement of spirit can express through your gifts, your work, your path. This expression is not ambition. It is not striving for success or spiritual achievement. It is the natural unfolding of the divine idea of you. The branch does not struggle to bear fruit. It simply remains connected to the vine, and so it is with you. 6. The world no longer dictates your inner state. Perhaps the clearest sign of realization is this: you become inwardly unmoved by outward circumstances. Whether the day brings challenge or ease, you remain centered. Whether the world praises you or ignores you, you remain steady. Whether the winds blow or the waters rise, you abide in the quiet certainty that the presence is your life and the activity of God is the only activity. This does not mean you become indifferent or detached. It means you no longer derive your identity from changing conditions. You live from within. You act from within. You draw your peace from within. And because your peace is rooted in the infinite, it is unbreakable. And 7. Grace becomes the governing principle of life. As realization matures, you begin to see a thread, a rhythm, a divine orchestration moving through your days. Things happen at precisely the right moment. People appear when needed. Paths open without planning. Difficulties transform into blessings before your eyes. You walk through life with a quiet amazement. How can it be that everything flows so harmoniously? This, my friends, is grace. Grace is the activity of God made visible. Grace is the unfoldment of the infinite through the transparency of your being. Grace is life lived without personal management, without strain, without self-will. Grace is the fruit of realization, and the one who lives by grace discovers the truth. Life does not need to be controlled. It needs only to be recognized. And now, my friends, we come gently to the close of this journey, not as an ending, but as a quiet turning back to the beginning. For all true spiritual teaching ends where it began, in the simplicity of God realized. We have traveled through the misunderstandings that cloud modern spirituality. We have looked into the way Jesus worked. We have seen why manifestation fails. We have explored how recognition, not effort, reveals the finished kingdom. And we have watched how life changes not through striving, but through the unfoldment of grace. And now, at this final moment, let us breathe and step into the stillness from which all of this arises. For all the words, all the principles, all the examples, all the practices lead to one simple, eternal truth, a truth so delicate, so pure, that the ego cannot grasp it, but the soul recognizes it instantly. God is the only presence. God is the only power. God is the only life. And this God is expressing as you, here and now. When this truth becomes your lived awareness, not merely your belief, fear dissolves. Not because fear is conquered, but because you have awakened to the reality that renders fear impossible. Lack dissolves. Not because you have manifested something new, but because you see that the infinite never withheld anything from its own expression. Sickness dissolves, not because you battled it, but because the realization of life, as God reveals the body as the instrument of spirit, not the structure of flesh. Loneliness dissolves, not because you found someone, but because you discovered that the presence within you is the very substance of love itself. Confusion dissolves, not because you figured out the right path, but because the light within illumines your way with each step you take. And so we return, gently and reverently, to the essence of the path. Recognition, not creation, transforms the world. Realization, not manifestation, reveals the kingdom. Stillness, not effort, is the doorway to God, experienced. You do not need to add anything to yourself. You do not need to attract anything from outside yourself. You do not need to move the universe by intention. You need only awaken to the truth that the infinite has already expressed itself as your very being. You are not becoming spiritual. You are remembering what has always been true. You are not acquiring God. You are recognizing the presence that has never left you. You are not climbing to a higher realm. You are sinking gently into the awareness of the realm that is already here, the realm Jesus called the kingdom within. All your striving can now rest. All your seeking can now be laid aside. All your spiritual effort can now relax into the simple recognition: God is here, God is now, God is the life I am. And as this realization deepens, life reveals itself as harmony, not because you shaped it, but because the presence expressing as you is harmony. And so let this be the quiet benediction of this entire teaching. Rest in the presence, trust the invisible, allow the Father within to do the works, and behold the miracle of life lived by grace alone. The journey ends here, in the same stillness from which it began. Nothing more needs to be added. Nothing more needs to be done. Simply abide, simply recognize, simply be, for it is finished.